Imagine a sound you will never hear, because the moment it reaches your ears, you will have already ceased to exist. Forget everything you knew about the fair battles of antiquity and heroic sword duels. In this video, we will uncover the dark, engineering side of ancient warfare, where math became more terrifying than any barbarian. You will learn how the Romans turned killing into a soulless industrial assembly line, and why the empire's deadliest machines required hundreds of pounds of human female hair. We will tell you about the shameful weapon of desperation that soldiers feared more than the enemy, because it maimed and killed its own crews. Why did the greatest minds of civilization spend their lives creating the perfect formula for death? And how did a single chemical reaction in the finale grind 1,000 years of mechanical history into dust, forever depersonalizing war? Watch until the end to see the moment humanity stepped into an era of true horror, from which we can never escape. Do you hear that sound? Probably not, because if you heard it, you would already be dead. This isn't the whistle of an arrow your ear has grown accustomed to over centuries of war. It isn't the rumble of a flying stone. It is the whisper of death itself, compressed into a fraction of a second. A dry, sharp crack, like a dead branch snapping in a winter forest. Only this sound means that somewhere 300 meters away from you, mathematics has just defeated biology. Welcome to a world where your bravery isn't worth a dime. To a world where war has ceased to be a contest of heroes and has turned into an engineering problem of eliminating manpower. Picture yourself as a Gallic chieftain. You are standing in the front row. You are wearing excellent chainmail, for which you traded a herd of oxen. In your hand is a heavy oak shield, covered in rawhide and reinforced with an iron boss. You believe in this shield. It has saved you from axe blows, from direct spear hits, from hails of arrows. You feel protected. You see the enemy, those little figures in red tunics somewhere in the distance, swarming around their strange wooden contraptions. You laugh. You shout insults, banging your sword against your shield, raising the morale of your tribe. You think you have time. You think the horns will sound any minute now, and an honest fight will begin, where the winner is the one with the fiercer heart and the stronger arm. What a naive, old-fashioned view of murder. Look closer at those contraptions. While you are screaming, over there, in silence and concentration, work is being done that has nothing to do with martial honor. There is no rage there. There is only calculation. The chief engineer checks the tension of the sinew bundles, tuning them so they hum in unison, like the strings of a monstrous lyre. He doesn't look you in the eye. He doesn't care about your hatred. To him, you are not an enemy, not a person, not a hero. You are a coordinate. You are a point in space that needs to be erased. He raises his hand. The lever operator makes a short movement. Click. You don't even have time to blink. A massive bolt with an iron tip, flying at a speed invisible to the human eye, slams into the center of your shield. The very second the metal touches the wood, all your faith in protection evaporates along with the splinters. The laws of physics are relentless. The kinetic energy of this projectile is such that it doesn't just pierce the shield. It ignores its existence. The iron passes through the oak, through your precious chainmail, through your rib cage, and exits your back, severing your spine. But the momentum is still too great. Your body, which a second ago was the pinnacle of warrior evolution, now turns into a rag doll, thrown backward with monstrous force. You slam into the warrior standing behind you. The tip pierces him too. And perhaps it only gets stuck in the third man. Silence. It descends instantly. The scream gets stuck in the throats of thousands of people. They look at what remains of their chief and cannot understand what happened. There is no enemy nearby. No one swung a sword. The gods did not hurl lightning. The air simply became solid and punched through 3 people. This is the moment when it's not the formation that breaks, but the psyche. This is that icy terror that freezes muscles harder than any frost. Do you see the panic in the eyes of your brethren? It isn't the fear of death. Dying in war is their job. It is the fear of the incomprehensible. It is the realization that the rules of the game have changed forever. Chivalry died the moment the first Roman engineer realized that a twisted bundle of hair stores more energy than a bent wooden bow. At that moment, standing on ground soaked in sweat and fear, you understand the main truth of the new era. Distance no longer saves you. Distance is just a variable in a formula the Romans have already solved. The Empire brought to the battlefield not just a new weapon, it brought an industrial approach. Look at that bolt sticking out of the pile of bodies. It isn't a crude, homemade item. It is a standardized munition, produced in a factory thousands of kilometers away. Its tip is cast from a single mold. Its shaft is turned to a single template. It is an assembly line of death working without glitches. What does a man feel when he realizes he is just a target in a shooting range? Powerlessness. Absolute, nauseating powerlessness. You cannot strike back. You cannot dodge what you cannot see. You can only wait for your turn. Every few seconds, a new, invisible whistle cuts the air, and another row of warriors turns into ground meat. Shields burst like eggshells. Helmets crumple like foil. Men fall not beautifully, as in ballads, but terrifyingly and messily, pinned to the ground, to trees, to each other. This is the anatomy of horror. This is not a battle. This is an execution. A methodical, cold, emotionless disposal of human material. The Romans don't hate you. They are simply clearing the space using superior technology. And the scariest thing about it is the sound. Not the screams of the dying, but the rhythmic clatter of mechanisms on the other side of the field. The creak of winches tightening the bowstrings. The strikes of hammers knocking out the stoppers. This sound is scarier than any battle cry because it is mechanistic. It is inhuman. It tells you, we don't care how much you want to live. We have physics, and it is on our side. Would you trust your life to a bundle of women's hair? Sounds absurd, doesn't it? But it is exactly these bundles, tightly twisted, soaked in oil and fat, that are now deciding the fate of nations. Hidden within them is a force capable of stopping a cavalry charge. Elastic energy, locked in a wooden frame, waits for its moment to burst out and turn living flesh into a memory. We stand on the threshold of the greatest turning point in military history. The moment when intellect became more dangerous than muscle. When one smart guy with a ruler and compass became worth more than 100 heroes with axes. The smell on the battlefield is changing. Mixing with the familiar stench of blood and filth is a new aroma. The sharp, technical smell of rancid oil used to lubricate mechanisms and burnt horn. It is the smell of progress. The smell of a civilization that decided killing must be efficient. You look at your hands gripping a useless weapon and realize your world is doomed. You cannot defeat a machine with bare hands. You cannot outshout mathematics. But how did we get here? How did humanity, which for centuries killed each other face to face, looking into the eyes of a dying enemy, suddenly decide to delegate death to mechanisms? Where did this monstrous idea come from? To accumulate energy in order to release it in one lethal impulse. After all, Rome didn't become like this overnight. There was a time when the legions also washed themselves in blood in fruitless attacks, when the walls of enemy cities laughed at their efforts. To understand the nature of this horror, We need to rewind time. We need to leave this field of slaughter and return to where the war reached a deadlock, to where the desperation of generals and the greed of politicians birthed the demand for an absolute weapon. War is not an art. It is a business plan written in blood. And like any business, it hates downtime. But by the 5th century BC, the Roman military machine, that pride of the Republic, had hit a wall. Literally. The expansion that fed Rome choked in the mud of protracted sieges. Do you think generals dreamed of new technologies out of a love for science? Nonsense. They dreamed of them because the old methods were bankrupting the state. Look at the map of that time. This isn't the triumphal march of legions written about in textbooks. It is a series of humiliating dead ends. The most vivid example is Veii, a wealthy Etruscan city just 15 kilometers from Rome. 15 kilometers is a day's journey for a merchant, but for the army, this journey stretched into 10 long, agonizing years. For 10 years, the legions stood under the walls, unable to do anything. Why? Because defensive technologies were centuries ahead of offensive technologies. Stone defeated muscle. It was simple, brutal arithmetic. The height of Veii's walls made siege ladders suicide. As soon as a legionary raised his head above the parapet, he was met with a spear thrust or an axe blow, amplified by gravity. It is always easier for a defender above to kill than for an attacker below. Gravity is defense's cheapest and most reliable ally. The Romans tried to use battering rams, huge logs with bronze heads, but a ram requires getting up close, and getting to the wall means entering the death zone. Boiling oil pours down, cobblestones fall, incendiary arrows fly. The ram burns faster than it can shake the masonry loose. And here, the real hell begins. Not on the walls, but in the besiegers' camp. The main enemy of the Roman soldier in that era was not the Etruscan archer, but dysentery. Sanitary losses in a prolonged siege exceeded combat losses by 5 times. Imagine a Roman camp near Veii in the autumn. Incessant rains turn the ground into greasy sludge. Legionaries, these celebrated warriors, rot alive in damp tents. The water is poisoned with sewage. Men die of fever, coughing up their lungs, shitting blood, and praying to the gods for death. This is not a heroic epic. This is a fetid pit where valor dissolves in feces. But even scarier were the economic losses. In those times, the Roman army was a militia. A legionary was a farmer who picked up a sword. If he sits under the walls of Veii for 10 years, who is plowing his land? No one. Fields are overgrown with weeds, families starve, the Republic's economy flies into the abyss. The Senate was furious. The treasury was emptying at a frightening speed. A war that was supposed to bring loot and slaves turned into a black hole sucking out resources. The generals needed a master key. They needed a means to pick this lock quickly and cheaply. They looked at the impregnable walls and realized the brute force of human muscles had reached its limit. The strongest man can throw a stone weighing 2 pounds about 50 yards. That's not enough. To break masonry, you need a stone weighing 100 pounds. To clear a wall of defenders, you need to shoot further than an arrow flies from a regular bow, and punch through shields. A monstrous energy deficit arose. The human body is a weak engine. It gets tired, it demands food, it breaks. An energy source exceeding human energy by dozens of times was needed. A concentration of effort in a single point was needed. Bureaucratic desperation in the headquarters tents reached its peak. Commanders, counting losses, were ready to sell their souls to any god or demon who would give them the ability to kill remotely and destructively. It was a strategic identity crisis. The sword, the spear, the shield, this sacred triangle of ancient war, stopped working in siege conditions. A hero with a sword is useless if he cannot reach the enemy. The entire warrior culture, built on personal courage and physical strength, crashed against the cold stone of fortifications. A quantum leap was needed. Not just a bigger sword or a stronger shield. The very principles of inflicting damage needed to change. The demand for innovation was formed not in the quiet of libraries, but in the mud of siege camps, under the screams of soldiers dying of typhus and the cursing of treasurers. Rome craved power. Power that knows no fatigue. Power that can be accumulated and unleashed on command. But the irony of fate was that Rome, for all its greatness, was a state of soldiers and lawyers, not inventors. They knew how to build roads and write laws, but their engineering thought was conservative. They were still trying to solve the problem by throwing masses of bodies at it. However, history abhors a vacuum. While Roman centurions looked wistfully at the wet walls of Veii, cursing their powerlessness, a solution was already brewing. But not here.
Far to the south, on the island of Sicily, in a city that also found itself ringed by enemies, one mad tyrant decided that if the gods wouldn't give him a weapon of victory, he would buy it from mathematicians. While Rome was only learning to count the losses from protracted wars, in Syracuse, they were already tightening the first sinews, preparing to turn geometry into a killer. Let's transport ourselves across space and time. Syracuse, the beginning of the 4th century BC. The sun ruthlessly scorches the white limestone of the fortress walls, but the heat radiating from the people inside is far more terrifying. The city is under siege. The Carthaginian fleet blocks the harbor. The enemy army tightens the ring on land. The air trembles with tension, smelling of burning and fear. An ordinary ruler in such a situation would pray to Zeus or Ares, sacrificing white bulls. But the tyrant Dionysius the Elder did not believe in prayers. He believed in the budget and human intellect. It is here, in the locked city, that an event takes place with no parallel in the history of the ancient world. Dionysius commits a management revolution. He announces the first state tender in history for the creation of a doomsday weapon. He gathers all the mathematicians, blacksmiths, carpenters, and mad inventors he can find, locks them in the arsenals, and says, "Figure out how to kill the enemy at a distance, or we all die." He pays them in gold, feeds them the best wine, gives them any resources. This was the Manhattan Project of antiquity, a laboratory for the production of death, working 24 hours a day to the accompaniment of enemy trumpets outside the walls. The problem these engineers faced was fundamental. The traditional bow had reached its physical ceiling. Wood, even the best composite kind, glued from different layers of horn and wood, has an elasticity limit. If you make the bow too thick, a man cannot bend it. If you make it too long, it will break when fired. The kinetic energy of the arrow was limited by the strength of the archer's arms and the properties of the material. A breakthrough was needed. Nature had to be cheated. And they cheated it. In the stuffy workshops of Syracuse, amidst sawdust and blueprints in the sand, an idea was born that changed the face of war forever. The principle of torsion. Twisting instead of bending. One of the engineers noticed that if you take a bundle of ropes, insert a lever between them, and twist, the force with which this lever strives to return is monstrous. It far exceeds the force of a straightening wooden stick. This was no longer the mechanics of a bow. This was the physics of accumulated tension. But ropes made of hemp or flax were no good.
They stretched, tore, rotted. A material with ideal elasticity was needed. Biological material. The answer was found in slaughterhouses and in women's boudoirs. It turned out that neck sinews of bulls and hair, yes, human hair and horse manes, possess unique properties. They can accumulate colossal energy when twisted and instantly release it without losing structure. Imagine this scene. It isn't romance. It is the harsh necessity of survival. The women of Syracuse cut off their long braids. Hundreds of pounds of hair fall to the floor. Not for fashion, not for mourning. This hair is immediately taken by craftsmen, soaked in oil and woven into thick ropes. Would you trust the defense of the city to your wife's hairdo? Dionysius did, and he didn't miscalculate. Sinews and hair became batteries of death. The engineers created a machine where two vertical bundles of elastic material, tightly twisted by levers, held the arms of a giant bow. Thus appeared the gastrophates, the belly bow, the great-grandfather of the ballista, and then the first stone throwers.
The mechanism was cocked not by hands, but by the weight of the whole body, leaning with the belly on the stock or using primitive winches. A click of the trigger, and the world changed. When the Carthaginians approached the walls of Matya, an ally of Syracuse, they expected the usual arrow barrage. They laughed, covering themselves with shields. But suddenly, something impossible rained down on them from the heavens. Stones weighing several dozen pounds flew 300 meters, sweeping away men, breaking siege towers, smashing through ship decks. It was a shock. Imagine going into an attack with a knife and having mortar fire opened up on you. The psychological effect was stronger than the physical one. The Carthaginians fled, screaming that the Syracusans had made a deal with demons. Later, the great Archimedes would bring this technology to absolute perfection, turning the defense of Syracuse into a mathematical hell for the Romans. He would teach the machines to shoot in a parabola, calculate angles, use counterweights. Legends speak of his mirrors and claws, but the real power was in torsion. He forced physics to work for defense so effectively that the Roman commander Marcellus, with bitter irony, called Archimedes a mythological Briareus, hurling rocks with 100 hands. But Syracuse, for all its genius, remained a Greek polis. They were artists of engineering. Each of their machines was a unique masterpiece, created by a specific master for a specific task. They had no standards. If a lever broke, a new one had to be carved, fitting it in place for hours. If a bundle of sinews tore, the machine was disassembled completely. It was the weapon of geniuses, but not the weapon of soldiers. The Greeks invented the concept, proved the theorem of death, showed the world that mathematics kills better than a sword. But they couldn't take the next step. They couldn't turn the art of killing into a trade. Across the sea, on the Apennine Peninsula, a predatory and pragmatic neighbor was watching these experiments. The Roman Republic. The Romans weren't great inventors. They were great optimizers. They looked at Greek machines not with admiration, but with cold calculation. They saw not a miracle of technology, but inefficiency of production. Why make every ballista unique, thought a Roman military tribune, if you can make them identical? While Syracuse celebrated the victory of reason, in Roman forges bellows were already being pumped, preparing to accomplish what Dionysus could not: to turn a brilliant invention into a soulless, stamped standard that would conquer the world not with elegance, but with mass production and repairability. The Greeks gave the world the idea. The Romans were about to give the world the assembly line. Syracuse fell. The great Archimedes was hacked down by a simple legionary who didn't know geometry and didn't appreciate the gray hair of a genius.
But the blueprints and trophy machines were sent to Rome not as museum exhibits, but as samples for dissection. The Republic didn't need unique miracles created by inspired loners. It didn't need capricious prima donnas of engineering requiring special handling. Rome needed the Kalashnikov of the ancient world. Reliable, crude, deadly, and, most importantly, uniform. Greek genius died so that Roman industry could be born. And this transition was scarier than any discovery of Archimedes because it turned war from an art into conveyor belt production. Roman engineers, the praefectus fabrum, looked at the Greek gastrophates and ballistas with the cold pragmatism of a foreman looking at the sketch of a mad architect. "It's beautiful," they said, "but how do we fix this in a German forest under pouring rain?" The answer was simple: you can't. And then Rome committed its main technological revolution. They invented standardization. They killed uniqueness for the sake of mass production. At the heart of the new military doctrine lay not magic and not prayer, but a dry, ruthless mathematical constant: the whole module. Vitruvius, that pedant of death, fixed a formula that became law for hundreds of workshops from Britain to Syria. All dimensions of the machine now depended on a single parameter: the weight of the stone it had to throw. Want to hurl a projectile weighing 60 pounds? The formula instantly gives you the diameter of the hole in the frame for the torsion bundle. And from this diameter, like ripples on water, all other dimensions radiate. The length of the levers, the height of the frame, the thickness of the bowstring. Does that sound boring? Only if you don't understand what it means in practice. It means that if a bronze bushing bursts on a ballista standing on a wall in North Africa, the engineer doesn't run to the blacksmith screaming, "Forge me something similar." No. He opens a crate of spare parts sent from Italy 6 months ago, takes out exactly the same bushing marked with the corresponding caliber, and it fits into place perfectly. Without fitting, without a file. Click, and the machine is ready to kill again. This was the first interchangeability of parts in history. While barbarians were still praying to the unique swords of their grandfathers, Rome was already fighting with replaceable blocks. Wooden frames, which rotted and cracked in the sun, the Romans bound in iron and bronze. Greek elegance was sacrificed for durability. The Roman ballista began to look like an industrial machine. Angular, heavy, ugly in its functionality. Tension washers got ratchet mechanisms, allowing the force of the shot to be calibrated to the joule. Now a commander could order, "Tension to 5 clicks," and 100 machines would deliver a synchronized volley, covering a given square with the density of hail. But the most terrifying things happened not on the battlefield, but in the rear. Look at the Roman baggage train. Among wagons with grain and amphorae of wine, travel nondescript carts covered in ox hides. What is inside? Not gold. There is death in disassembled form. Coils of spare sinews from ox necks and women's hair, stored in barrels of olive oil so they don't dry out. Crates with forged tips for bolts, cast by the thousands from a single mold. Replacement bronze washers for torsions. The Legion dragged a whole factory behind it. War turned into a logistical task. The quartermaster of the Legion was now more important than the hero centurion. It was he who ensured that fuel for these machines arrived uninterrupted. You can be thrice brave, but if you don't have replacement sinews, your ballista is just a pile of firewood. The Romans were the first to understand that complex technology requires complex infrastructure. They created specialized units of ballistarii, men who didn't learn to fence. They learned to turn nuts, lubricate mechanisms, and calculate trajectories. These weren't warriors in the classical sense. They were technician killers. Now, every legion, according to the staffing table, carried 55 carroballistae, light bolt throwers on wheels, a kind of machine gun cart of antiquity, and 10 heavy stone throwers for destroying fortifications. This ceased to be siege exotica. It became as standard a tool as a shovel for digging a trench or a pilum. Artillery was integrated into infantry tactics at the molecular level. The legion no longer closed with the enemy for hand-to-hand combat until the machines ground the first rows of the adversary into meat. Imagine the sound of a Roman military workshop. It is the rhythmic, maddening thunder of hundreds of hammers. It is the hiss of red-hot metal plunged into water. It is the smell of burnt horn and hot oil. There is no place for creativity here. The dictatorship of the standard reigns here. A master who tried to make a part prettier, violating the blueprint, would be flogged and demoted. Because beauty doesn't kill. Repeatability kills. The system kills. Rome turned war into an accounting report, where tons of iron and kilometers of sinews were listed in the expenses column and destroyed civilizations in the profit column. The machine was ready. It was debugged, lubricated, and replicated in thousands of copies. It waited for only one thing: a man who would cast aside the last prejudices of the old school and start using this tool with absolute, icy cynicism. A man who would understand that the ballista is needed not to break walls, but to break will.
And such a man was already putting on his cloak, preparing to cross the Alps to show the Gauls what true Roman efficiency is.
Gaul, 52nd year BC. The city of Avaricum. If you think you know what hopelessness is, you are mistaken. Hopelessness is standing on the walls of Avaricum and watching a Roman siege ramp crawl toward your gates meter by meter, like a living creature made of mud and logs. But the Gauls are not afraid. They laugh. They built the Murus Gallicus, a brilliant construction of wooden beams and stone that cannot be smashed by a ram and cannot be burned. They feel safe. They don't yet know that Gaius Julius Caesar has come to them, and he brought with him not just legions. He brought with him a new method of warfare, where the lead violin is played not by heavy artillery crushing walls, but by a surgical instrument of terror, the scorpion. Imagine a device slightly larger than a crossbow, but mounted on a stand.
It looks unserious against the background of giant stone throwers.
But this is an illusion. The scorpion is the sniper rifle of the ancient world. Its task is not to break stone. Its task is to shut down biological units. Caesar, that cold pragmatist, turns the siege of Avaricum into a shooting gallery. He understands, why spend months destroying a wall if you can simply slaughter everyone standing on it? The hunt begins. Roman engineers set up scorpions on siege towers, raising them to the eye level of the defenders. The crews work calmly, without fuss. They don't see enemies' faces, they see targets. The gunner turns the winch, checking tables. Wind? Correction 2 clicks left. Distance 200 meters? Raise the angle half a degree. This isn't a battle. It is the geometry of death. You are a Gallic sentry. You lean out from behind a battlement for a fraction of a second to throw a torch at the Roman ramp. That time is enough. A bolt as thick as a finger, flying at the speed of sound, hits you exactly in the eye socket. You don't hear the shot. Your brain simply stops functioning before the sound of the bowstring release reaches it. You fall dead without making a sound. Your comrade, seeing the torch didn't reach its target, picks it up and takes a step forward. A second later, he is lying next to you with a pierced throat. A third. A fourth. In his commentaries, Caesar describes this episode with the frightening dispassion of a technical report. At one of the gates of Avaricum, Gauls tried to set fire to the Roman ramp. One warrior came out to throw a piece of fat into the fire. A strike of the scorpion. he is dead. His place is taken by the next. A strike, corpse falls on corpse. A third comes out, a fourth. This continued until a mountain of bodies blocked the passage. Do you understand the horror of the situation? This isn't heroism. This is an assembly line.
The Roman machine worked with the rhythm of a metronome.
Load, tension, release, death. Load, tension, release, death.
The psychological effect of such shelling was monstrous. The Gauls, accustomed to seeing the enemy, accustomed to fierce skirmishes, faced invisible death. The walls of Avaricum became a trap. Any attempt to raise a head, any careless gesture, was punished instantly and brutally. Defenders stopped coming out onto the walls. The towers emptied. The city was paralyzed with fear. The Romans effectively cleared the perimeter without engaging in hand-to-hand combat. Think about the cynicism of this tactic. Caesar used mathematics to suppress the will of an entire people. He showed that bravery is an outdated concept. You can be the strongest warrior in the tribe. You can be a berserker who feels no pain. But for a Roman engineer, you were just a vertical target 50 centimeters wide.
And if your coordinates coincide with the flight trajectory of a bolt, you are a corpse. No options, no right to a last strike. This was a new type of war, a war of attrition on the nervous system. Scorpions shot through not only flesh, they shot through the very idea of resistance. Barbarians surrendered not because their fortifications collapsed. The walls stood firm. They surrendered because they were methodically, one by one, crossed off the list of the living by people who weren't even sweating. It was humiliating. To die by the sword is an honor. To die from a piece of iron that flew from nowhere is statistics. Avaricum fell. Roman legionaries bursting into the city staged a massacre, sparing neither women nor the old. But the real victory was won earlier. It was won the moment the Gallic garrison realized their gods had abandoned them, and the laws of ballistics were fighting on the side of the Romans. Caesar proved that a well-tuned machine is more effective than 1,000 heroes. He turned artillery from an auxiliary means into an instrument of domination. But this coin had a flip side. The triumph of technology in Gaul spawned a false sense of omnipotence. The Romans believed that now they were invincible. They forgot one important nuance. The machine has no loyalty. It doesn't care who it shoots at. A torsion bundle doesn't distinguish who pulls the lever, a citizen of Rome or an enemy of the Republic. And very soon, just a few years after the bloodbath at Avaricum, this truth would crash down on the creators themselves with such force that the Mediterranean itself would shudder. The weapon created to conquer barbarians was preparing to turn against its masters. Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, was walking toward the Rubicon, and behind his back creaked the wheels of carts loaded with scorpions, which would soon look into the faces not of Celts, but of fellow Romans. Mathematics was preparing to kill its teachers. Civil war stood on the threshold, and there would be no room for mercy in it, because both sides knew the secret of manufacturing death. Welcome to the hell of equal opportunity. The worst nightmare of any engineer is to see his own blueprints in the hands of the enemy. Until now, the Roman military machine had been a predator playing with prey. It was a lion hunting a lame antelope. But in the 49th year BC, when the Rubicon was left behind and the Republic split in two, the rules changed. The predator looked in the mirror and saw another predator. The civil war began. Romans went against Romans, and the most terrible thing in this confrontation was that both sides learned from the same textbooks, used the same calibers, and knew each other's vulnerabilities by heart. Welcome to the walls of Massilia. Here, on the shore of the Azure Sea, the first full-scale duel of artillery systems in history played out.
This was no longer the methodical shooting of Gauls as in Avaricum. It was a deadly match between two grand masters, where every mistake costs 1,000 lives. On the city walls stand the best Greek machines, reinforced by the Roman pragmatism of the Pompeians. Below, in the siege camp, Caesar's engineers are working. No technological gap, absolute parity of death. Have you ever seen a ballista shoot at a ballista? It is a spectacle not for the faint of heart. The Massiliates rolled out monsters preserved from ancient times onto the towers, huge torsion machines capable of hurling not just stones, but logs 12 feet long with iron tips. Caesar's Roman legionaries, accustomed to hiding behind their famous tortoise formations and light wooden vinia shelters, discovered with horror that their protection had turned into paper. Heavy spears punched through the roofs of siege sheds, pinning men to the ground, punching through planks, flesh, and going deep into the soil. It was a shock. For the first time, the Legion faced kinetic energy it could not dampen. The usual tactic, approach, undermine, burn, didn't work. As soon as the Caesarians began to build a ramp, they were covered with such dense fire that the space itself turned into a meat grinder. Do you hear that sound? It isn't just a whistle. It is a roar, like the noise of a train. Logs flying from the walls smashed siege towers like matchboxes. The engineers in Caesar's camp were tearing their hair out. Their usual methods had become useless. They were opposed by professionals just like them, who knew, if they build a wooden tower, we will hit the base with incendiary projectiles. If they come in a tortoise, we will drop boulders weighing a ton. Here begins the most interesting part. An arms race in real time. When old schemes stopped working, the genius of survival kicked in. Caesar's legionaries, realizing wood wouldn't save them, do the impossible. Right under a hail of arrows and stones, they begin to build a brick tower. Not a wooden frame covered in skins, but a full-fledged concrete and brick pillbox 6 stories high, walls 5 feet thick, floors made of beams hidden in the masonry so fire couldn't reach them. It was a triumph of engineering audacity. The defenders of Massilia were going crazy. They hurled everything they had at this tower. Incendiary barrels smashed against brick, but couldn't ignite stone. Heavy bolts bounced off the masonry, striking sparks. The Romans built a tank. Slowly, inch by inch, this stone monster crawled toward the wall. From its top, scorpions began to mow down the crews of enemy machines. Imagine this hell. Dust from smashed brick hangs in the air like red fog. Men cough blood and cement dust. Romans kill Romans with efficiency honed over centuries. There is no place for brother against brother pity here. There is only the cold calculation of trajectories. An engineer on the wall sees the muzzle flash below and realizes he has 1.5 seconds. He doesn't even have time to curse. The bolt smashes his torsion mechanism, the sinews burst with the sound of a cannon shot, and the released energy of the levers tears the machine itself and everyone standing nearby to shreds. A man-made disaster on a local scale. In this fratricidal slaughter, the romance of civic duty died. Only naked functionality remained. The winner was not the one with the truth, and not the one with the Senate. The winner was the one who had better spare parts logistics, and who figured out faster how to protect their torsions from return fire. Massilia fell not from hunger, but because Caesar's engineers outplayed Pompey's engineers in a chess match where the pieces were multi-ton throwing machines. When the smoke cleared
and the last defenders laid down their arms, the world saw a terrifying picture. The best army in the world destroyed itself using its best achievements. The Civil War ended in the total victory of the system over the individual. Caesar became a dictator, and then a god. But the real winner was the ballista. It proved to be the absolute argument in any dispute, even if the dispute is between one's own people. Silence fell. A terrifying, ringing silence that historians would call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. There were no enemies left. Carthage destroyed, Greece conquered, Gaul pacified, domestic rebels slaughtered. The Mediterranean Sea became an internal lake of the empire. It would seem this was a golden age, an age of stability and prosperity. But for military engineering, this was the beginning of the end. For there is nothing more ruinous for complex technology than the absence of a worthy opponent. When there is no one to fight, when no one challenges your walls, why spend insane money on maintaining complex machines? Why teach mathematics to new officers if barbarians on the borders scatter at the mere sight of a legionary eagle? In this well-fed, calm silence, under the shadow of marble porticos, a virus began to ripen that would prove more dangerous than any war. The virus of complacency and oblivion. Masters who could tune a torsion with their eyes closed were aging. Their apprentices no longer saw the point in such precision. Good enough, they began to whisper in the arsenals. The great degradation crept up unnoticed, hiding behind the shine of the golden armor of parade guards. Peace is the most insidious poison for an empire. It kills slower than arsenic, but more surely than any sword. When the last worthy enemy was beaten into the dust, and Rome's borders froze in granite and marble, the great military machine began to devour itself. The Pax Romana arrived, the Golden Age poets and philosophers dreamed of. But for engineers, it was an era of great rot. In the silence of garrison fortresses, where legionaries didn't draw their swords from their scabbards for years, a terrible thing was happening. The loss of competence. Technologies don't die in a day. They fade, like coals in a fire that someone forgot to feed. Look at a legion of the 2nd century AD. It shines with gold and purple. Parades have become more important than drills. Officers now get their posts not for the ability to calculate the flight trajectory of a stone, but for the right pedigree and connections in the Senate. The old masters, those cynical practitioners who could determine uneven torsion tension by ear, go to their graves. And who comes to replace them? No one. Why learn complex math if barbarians beyond the Rhine sit quietly, frightened by the glory of ancestors? Why spend years training an architectus if his skills aren't needed? The era of the efficiency experts of antiquity begins. In the quartermaster services, the deadly logic of economy is born. Do you know how much specially processed sinews from bull necks cost? It is colossal money. It is complex logistics: slaughter, selection, processing, drying, soaking. And women's hair? You can't get it now. Patrician women prefer complex hairstyles, not patriotic sacrifices. And so, in some distant garrison in Britain, a supply officer decides, why do we need sinews? Let's take hemp. Rope is 10 times cheaper, and it shoots, well, almost the same. Almost is a killer word. Rope stretches. Rope rots from the humidity of foggy Albion. It doesn't give that explosive impulse, that dry recoil. Shooting range drops by 1/3, penetrating power by half. But in reports to Rome, everything is fine. Budget savings, bonus for the quartermaster. The legion is fully stocked with artillery, on paper. But in reality, standing on the fortress walls are no longer sniper instruments, but mock-ups of weapons.
Metal goes too. Bronze bushings, those precision parts that allowed the machine to be calibrated, are gradually replaced by low-quality iron, or even hard wood. Wood swells from rain. Mechanisms jam. Ratchets strip. Vitruvius's great formula of the whole, that holy grail of Roman engineering, turns into an empty sound. Young soldiers look at calibration tables like magic spells whose meaning is lost. They just turn levers by eye. Accuracy? Forget it. If the projectile flew in that direction, that's already good. And then comes the crisis of the 3rd century. Inflation devours the empire's economy. The silver denarius turns into a cheap copper coin. There is no money for anything. A complex 2-armed ballista is the Ferrari of the ancient world. It requires elite maintenance. It needs to be lubricated with expensive olive oil, protected from sun and dampness, and torsions regularly retightened even if not shooting, so they don't lose elasticity. In conditions of chaos, when emperors change every 2 months and legions loot their own provinces for food, these capricious machines become a burden. Imagine this picture. An abandoned fort on the border with Dacia. In the corner of the armory room, covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs, stands a classical ballista from the time of Trajan. A masterpiece of engineering thought. But its torsions snapped long ago and hang like pitiful rags. Metal parts are eaten by rust. No one in the garrison knows how to fix it anymore. No one knows how to calculate the elevation angle. For the local soldiers, it is just a pile of junk taking up space. In the end, the centurion orders it broken up for firewood to keep warm on a cold night. This is how civilization dies. Not with the crash of falling walls, but with the quiet squeak of a rusty hinge. Knowledge accumulated over centuries evaporates in a couple of generations of ignorance. The Romans forgot how to build complex things. They returned to a primitive understanding of war, mob against mob. The intellectual superiority that allowed one legion to hold a whole province vanished. Now, to defeat barbarians, they had to become barbarians themselves. And when the enemies came again, and they always return, sensing weakness, Rome turned out to be unarmed. Goths, Alemanni, Persians, they rolled in waves, and the legions could only oppose them with good old swords and shields. Artillery parks, once the pride of the army, turned into graveyards of technology. In an attempt to somehow compensate for the loss of sniper accuracy and range, the remnants of the engineering school went down the path of degradation. If we can't make a precise mechanism, let's make a simple and crude one. If we can't hit the chieftain in the eye, let's just throw a heavier rock in that direction. Out of this hopelessness, out of the ruins of high science, the monster of a new era began to crawl out. A weapon of desperation. Primitive, dangerous to its own crews, devoid of any elegance, but cheap and lethal. Rome was saying goodbye to mathematics and preparing to meet the era of brute force. Replacing the complex, violin-like ballista came a one-armed monster that soldiers would nickname the Wild Ass. And this ass kicked so hard that bones cracked in the artillerymen themselves. Welcome to the era of degeneration. Take a step back from the drafting table where ideal schematics of two-armed machines lay. Brush the dust off geometry textbooks. You won't need them anymore. We are entering dark times, when elegance died, and the sniper's scalpel was replaced by a rusty, jagged sledgehammer. Before you is the Onager, a machine that became the epitaph of the Roman engineering school. Look at this monster. It is ugly even aesthetically. If the classical ballista resembled a bird of prey ready to pounce,
The Onager is a pile of logs knocked together haphazardly, like a shipwreck survivor's raft.
There is no symmetry here. There are no two arms working in unison. Roman masters, having lost their qualifications, could no longer synchronize complex mechanisms. They couldn't guarantee that the right and left torsions would deliver the same impulse. And if the impulse is different, the projectile flies nowhere. The solution, primitive to the point of nausea, remove the second arm. Leave a single, monstrously thick bundle of sinews, lay it horizontally, and stick a lever into it. Soldiers nicknamed it the Wild Ass. And this isn't an affectionate nickname. It is a warning. Step closer, but stay away from the rear of the frame. When the gunner knocks out the stopper with a hammer, it isn't a shot that happens. An explosion of kinetic energy happens. The massive lever, describing an arc, slams with a deafening crash into the stop beam, padded with soft cushioning. The impact is of such force that this entire multi-ton structure hops off the ground. It rears up and kicks back like a rabid animal.
The earth shakes. Dust rises in a column, hiding the crew. This is a weapon of desperation. It was created by people who understood. We can no longer hit the enemy in the eye. We can't even hit a shield. So, we need a weapon that doesn't need accuracy. The Onager is the shotgun of artillery. It doesn't shoot bolts. It hurls boulders. Stones weighing 100, 120, sometimes 150 pounds. They aren't even hewn into ideal spheres like before. Why bother? Ballistics are terrible anyway. Into the spoon, or sling at the end of the lever, they put any boulder found in the vicinity, or a sack with an incendiary mixture, or, even worse, severed heads of prisoners to sow plague in the besieged city. This is the dirty war of the late Empire. There is no place for chivalry and duels of engineers here. The principle, whatever God sends, reigns here. The stone flying out of the Onager flies in a high, steep arc. Its flight is unpredictable. It tumbles in the air, humming like an angry beehive. But when it falls, oh, that sound of impact. It isn't the dry click of pierced armor. It is the wet, crunching sound of crushed flesh. The boulder doesn't kill one man. It turns a dense formation of infantry into a bloody clearing. Shields, helmets, bones, all of this mixes into a single mass pressed into the soil. The Onager knows no pity for strangers or its own. Serving in the crew of this machine is a punishment, an exile for disciplinary cases. You stand next to a mechanism that tries to kill you with every shot. Vibration loosens the fastenings. Metal, the quality of which in the 4th century dropped below critical levels, is full of micro cracks. The stop beam often fails. Imagine, the lever breaks the limiter and continues its movement, flipping backward right onto the heads of the artillerymen.
Or an over-twisted torsion bursts. A bundle of sinews as thick as an adult man's thigh, snapping under tension of dozens of tons, acts like a giant whip. It cuts people in half, takes off heads, breaks spines. Onager crews died from their own machines more often than from enemy fire. But the Empire didn't care. Women will bear more men, but there is no one to make a complex ballista. The Onager became a symbol of the barbarization of the army. Romans, who once prided themselves on fighting with their minds, now fought with mass. Brute force replaced intellect. Instead of calculating a trajectory, they simply increased the mass of the projectile. Instead of preserving the mechanism, they made it out of cheap logs that were no pity to abandon when retreating. It was the agony of a technological civilization. Do you smell that? It isn't the smell of grease and progress that hung over Caesar's legions. It is the smell of raw wood, cheap, rancid fat, and fear. Artillerymen pray before every volley, not for victory, but that the ass doesn't kick them. Officers look at this wretchedness with longing, realizing that the secrets of ancestors are lost irrevocably. Complex blueprints rotted in libraries, and new masters only know how to hew logs with an axe. But the worst thing was that even this crude power was unreliable. The Onager, like the ballista, was a hostage of biology. Its heart is organic: sinews, hair, skin. And organics hate moisture. Late autumn, endless rains, fog, and mighty artillery turns into useless junk. Ropes get wet and lose elasticity. They stretch. The stone, instead of flying 300 meters, falls pitifully 50 paces away, causing enemy laughter. Humanity hit the ceiling of torsion technology. You can't infinitely increase the bundle of sinews. It simply won't twist. You can't infinitely increase the lever. It will break. Roman military thought reached a dead end. Machines became too capricious, too expensive to operate, and too dangerous for the owners. A new principle was needed. A force was needed that doesn't depend on weather, doesn't rot, and doesn't get tired. A force that works always, as long as planet Earth exists. Somewhere in the East, in the minds of Byzantine and Arab scholars, an idea was already beginning to dawn that would bury torsion artillery forever. An idea simple as a falling apple. Gravity. Why twist sinews if you can use the weight of the Earth? Why fight nature if you can force it to work for you? The era of the living spring was ending under the roar and creak of clumsy onagers, paving the way for the silent giants of the next era. While the West drowned in barbarian mud, and Roman engineers forgot which end to hold a compass, life flickered in the East. Constantinople, the second Rome. A city armored in the triple ring of the Theodosian walls, which were considered impregnable. Here, in cool libraries and arsenals, the Byzantines desperately tried to preserve the fire of ancient knowledge. They blew dust off the blueprints of Archimedes and Hero. They crammed the treatises of Vitruvius, trying to breathe life into dying mechanics. But this was already agony, not a renaissance. Technological evolution is a one-way street, and it's impossible to turn back. Byzantines were still betting on torsions. Their machines, mangonels and heavy stone throwers, were more elegant than the crude Western wild asses. They used the best types of wood. They brewed complex adhesive compounds to strengthen frames. They bought silk and expensive sinews. But they were fighting an enemy that cannot be defeated by sword or cunning. They were fighting climate and economics. Torsion artillery is a capricious prima donna. It requires ideal conditions. And Byzantium's wars took place either under the scorching sun of Syria or in the damp mists of the Black Sea.
Moisture is the killer of tension.
Imagine you are preparing for a decisive volley. The fleet of the Arab Caliphate is on the horizon. You tighten the levers. But it rained at night. Humidity rose. Hygroscopic sinews absorbed water, swelled and weakened. You pull the trigger, expecting a lethal strike, but instead, the stone lazily falls out of the spoon and lands in the moat under the wall. The physics of elasticity failed you. Organics betrayed you. At this moment, the Byzantine engineer realizes, we have hit a dead end. We cannot depend on the weather forever. And while imperial mechanics tried to dry sinews by braziers, from the east, from China through the Arab world, came a new, frighteningly simple idea. Why suffer with accumulating energy in twisted fibers if we have energy that works always, everywhere, and for free? Energy that doesn't give a damn about rain, frost, or the master's qualification. Gravity. Enter the trebuchet.
Forget everything you knew about ballistas. A ballista is a giant bow. A trebuchet is giant scales. The principle of operation is primitive to the point of genius. A huge lever on an axle. On the short arm hangs a colossal weight, a box with earth, lead, or stones. On the long arm, a sling with a projectile. No complex torsions, no capricious sinews, only pure, relentless gravity. You lower the long arm with a winch, raising the counterweight. At this moment, you pump potential energy into the system. Click of the trigger. The counterweight falls down. Gravity accelerates the lever. The long arm soars into the sky, dragging the sling with it. The projectile receives monstrous acceleration due to centrifugal force. This isn't the sharp, dry snap of a ballista. It is a long, rising drone, turning into a whistle. Whoosh. And a boulder weighing 200, 400, 600 pounds goes into the stratosphere. It was a technological knockout. Torsion artillery had a physical limit. It could rarely throw a stone heavier than 170 pounds. The trebuchet laughed at these numbers. For a gravity machine, there is no limit. Want to throw a stone weighing half a ton? Just make the lever longer and the counterweight box bigger. Pour more earth in there. This is scalable death. Look at the faces of Byzantine engineers. Terror and admiration are read in their eyes. They see barbarian simplicity defeating their sophisticated science. The trebuchet doesn't require expensive sinews. It can be built by any carpenter from any wood found in the nearest forest. The counterweight can be filled with trash, stones, sand. Gravity doesn't care what pulls the lever down. It is the weapon of poverty that turned out to be more effective than the weapon of wealth. Wars changed. If before walls could withstand ballista fire, now, under trebuchet blows, masonry crumbled into dust. Projectiles of such weight didn't just breach. They caused a concussion of the entire foundation. Trebuchets began to hurl not just stones. They hurled incendiary mixtures, corpses of plague-ridden cows, barrels of filth. It was total war for annihilation. The Byzantine Renaissance of mechanics choked. Why learn geometry and calculate elasticity if the brute force of a falling box works more reliably? Master ballistari, keepers of Vitruvius's secrets, became unneeded. They were replaced by brigades of lumberjacks and diggers. The era of the living spring, the era of organic artillery, which lasted 1500 years, ended. Humanity rejected biology in favor of solid-state physics. It was a sad finale for ancient science. Elegant formulas were forgotten for a simple axiom. The heavier the counterweight, the more it hurts the enemy. The walls of Constantinople, those masterpieces of fortification, still stood, but they already felt the trembling of the earth. They were designed to take the hit of a ram and light stones. They were not calculated for pieces of rock the size of a cart flying into them. But inertia of thinking is strong. Byzantines clung to their mangonels to the last, considering trebuchets a weapon of barbarians. They despised this crude mechanics, calling it primitive. Irony of fate, it is this primitive force that, a few centuries later, would help the Ottomans wipe their empire off the face of the earth. But before that happens, the last, final act of the drama must occur. An act where mechanics gives way to chemistry. Somewhere far away, in the laboratories of Taoist monks seeking the elixir of immortality, a spark had already flared that would turn both ballistas and trebuchets into firewood. Gunpowder. Black powder that would render levers, counterweights, and walls meaningless. We stand on the threshold of the moment when war ceases to be a question of kinetic energy of muscles or gravity and becomes a question of chemical reaction. The silence before the storm becomes deafening. Do you hear it? It isn't the creak of a trebuchet. It is the fuse already burning. May 29th, 1453, Tuesday. Remember this day. It isn't just a date on the calendar. It is the day antiquity officially died, choking on its own powerlessness. We stand at the walls of Constantinople, the Theodosian walls, a masterpiece of fortification that laughed in the face of barbarians for 1,000 years. 3 rows of stone and brick, bound with mortar that became harder than granite over the years. A deep moat, towers, battlements. This construction seemed eternal. It outlived Huns, Avars, Arabs, Bulgarians.
It was the embodiment of the old doctrine: stone always wins.
But on that morning, the air over the Bosphorus trembled not from fear, but from something new. From a sound the human ear had not yet learned to classify. It wasn't a whistle, not a creak, not a crack. It was thunder born on earth. A roar that burst the eardrums of defenders on the walls and made birds fall dead from the shockwave. Look at the other side of the field. There, amidst the Ottoman camp, stands a monster. Its name is the Basilica. It isn't a machine in the usual sense. It is a bronze pipe 27 feet long, cast by the Hungarian engineer Orban, a man who first offered his services to the Byzantine emperor. But the emperor had no money, and Sultan Mehmed II had money. And Orban, that cynical mercenary of progress, sold the secret of the apocalypse to the one who paid. Irony of history. A Christian empire is destroyed by a Christian engineer on the money of a Muslim sultan.
Technology has no religion. It serves the one who feeds it resources.
Here, under Constantinople, the final battle of 2 physical principles takes place. On the city walls stand the last Roman ballistas and small trebuchets. They work on mechanical energy. They use elasticity and gravity. This is honest physics. You see the lever tighten, you understand where the force comes from. And below, in the maw of the basilica, the magic of chemistry happens. Black powder, a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. Gunpowder. This is no longer mechanics. It is the release of molecular bond energy. Instant transformation of a solid substance into gas, the volume of which exceeds the original by thousands of times. It isn't a push, it is a shockwave. A stone ball weighing 1,300 pounds flies out of the barrel not because a spring pushed it, but because a small hell opened up behind its back. Impact. When Orban's cannonball slams into the Theodosian wall, something happens that neither torsions nor counterweights could achieve in 10 centuries. The wall doesn't just crack, it is annihilated. The kinetic energy of the projectile, accelerated by powder gases, is such that the stone turns into sand. Ancient masonry, which stood for a millennium, crumbles like a dry biscuit. Dust rises to the heavens, blocking out the sun. The defenders are in horror. They try to patch the breaches. They drag bags of wool, tapestries, logs, trying to soften the blows. But this is agony. Mechanics has no defense against chemistry. Roman ballistas on the walls try to respond. They hurl their darts and stones at the Ottoman artillerymen, but it looks pathetic. It is like throwing toothpicks at a rhinoceros. The firing range of cannons, their killing power, their psychological effect, all of this is in another dimension. Every shot of the Basilica is a funeral toll for the old era.
The cannon needs to be cooled with oil. It needs to be cleaned. It takes hours to load. It can fire only 7 times a day. But every single shot changes geography. Towers collapse, burying beneath them the last keepers of the secrets of Greek fire and torsion twists.
The roar of bombards drowns out the creak of throwing machines. No one hears the thin singing of tightened sinews anymore. That sound drowned in the roar of artillery cannonade. On May 29th, the walls fell. Janissaries burst into the city through breaches punched by gunpowder. The last Emperor Constantine threw off his purple boots and rushed into the thick of the fight to die like a Roman, sword in hand. But his death was only a symbol. The real death came for the ballista. At the moment the crescent rose over the Hagia Sophia, engineering thought finally changed its vector. Why act with complex lever calculations? Why need capricious bull sinews that rot from rain? Why need women's hair and calibrated counterweights? All of this became trash, archaic, museum exhibits. Now the world is ruled by a cast iron pipe and black powder. War became simpler, louder, and deadlier. The ballista, that triumph of reason born in Syracuse, having traveled the path from the brilliant gastrophetes to the industrial standard of legions, died not on the battlefield. It died of old age and uselessness. They simply stopped building it. Its blueprints we used to kindle furnaces where metal was melted for new cannons. Mathematics didn't disappear, no. It just changed clothes. It changed Euclid's geometry for Tartaglia's ballistics. It stopped counting tension angles and started counting saltpeter proportions. We have come a long way. We started by fearing to approach the enemy and figured out how to throw a stone at him without risking our lives. We turned this fear into science. We learned to accumulate energy in sinews, in wood, in twisted ropes. We created an industry of death, standardized murder, turned it into an assembly line. We brought mechanics to perfection, and then, hitting its limit, betrayed it for a chemical explosion. Now, looking back at these 2,000 years of evolution, ask yourself one question. We began to kill more efficiently. We learned to wipe cities off the face of the earth with the push of a single button or the lighting of a fuse. We replaced muscle power with the energy of the atom. But has the world become safer because we learned to kill the enemy without even seeing the color of his eyes? The ballista was cruel. It was bloody, but it demanded skill. It demanded contact. It was honest. The cannon, and after it the rocket and the drone, depersonalized death completely. Now murder is just coordinates on a screen and a flash on the horizon. The history of the ballista is the history of how we tried to run away from the horror of hand-to-hand combat, but in the end created a horror from which it is impossible to run. Do you hear the silence? The ancient machines are silent. Their time is up. Our era has arrived. The era of gunpowder, steel, and fire. And in this era, we all have to live or die. The choice, as always, is up to the engineers.